And normally you'll probably find that you'll have to take the suspension spring and the suspension rod off together. Although in this instance they did fall apart. That's a rare occurrence, and more usually they stay together. This is more usually what happens when you remove the pin. They stay together, and so you lift the suspension spring off, turn the suspension rod to lift it off the crutch. And then unhook the suspension spring from the rod, like so, and put that to one side for cleaning, and the suspension rod to one side for cleaning. Right, now we've got rid of the vulnerable suspension spring, the next thing we would do is to take the power off of the clock. You've always got to take the power off of both strains before dismantling the clock. That's an absolute necessity. So in this particular instance, I'm going to use a letting down key, and I'm going to find an appropriate size key, which is probably about number 6 or 8. That's a good fitting key. So we've fit the key to the handle. And now to take the power off, pop the key onto the square, have a suitable tool ready, and now wind slightly, disengage the click from the ratchet wheel, and then allow the letting down tool to slip through the hand under control until all of the power is removed from the barrel. Avoid lifting the click out too far. All that's necessary is to clear the tips of the ratchet wheel. Avoid chipping the tips out of the teeth of the ratchet wheel. Avoid putting a permanent bend into the click spring. Now once you feel that all of the power is off, just feel the barrel to make sure that it's perfectly free. That convinces me now that all of the power is removed. So turn the clock over and do similarly with the time side. So insert the key, wind slightly, disengage the click, and then once again let the mainspring down under control. Once you feel all the power is down, just agitate the key slightly, release the click, and then once again feel that the barrel is free. So both barrels are now free and the clock is safe to strip. First I would remove the hammer, which is just a matter of removing this pin. This pin is actually inserted from the wrong side. Normally the pin would be inserted from this side. Remove the hammer. Now we're going to tackle the removal of the pallet. Seems to be out of range for the camera for the moment. So it's a question of undoing those two screws there on the pallet clock. Remove those two screws. Remove the pallet cock and remove the pallets. Put those to one side. Now turn the clock over and I would first of all remove the minute wheel. To do that, you're going to have to remove the clip holding the minute wheel. Remove the washer. Remove the hour wheel and removes the minute wheel. Always check on the underneath side of the minute wheel to make sure there isn't a loose washer there or a loose washer on the post for the minute wheel there. Now remove the rack. Removes the rack hook, and in this particular instance the rack hook is held in by a taper pin just there. You just about see, there we are, you just see the pin there now. So withdraw that pin, and afterwards I'm going to withdraw the pin for the lifting piece, which is here. So both of those pins are now removed. So that's the lifting piece that can now be removed. And that's the pin removed on the lifting piece. Now remove the lifting piece. Now with all of that gone, we get a better view of the cannon pinion, and on the cannon pinion we can quite clearly see the two lifters. And we can even see there that the lower one is shorter than the top one. So the lower one is to operate the half hour, and the top one is to operate the hour. The top one is long enough to allow the rack to fall. Next, remove these two screws, there and there, which are holding the ratchet wheel bridges. Now with early clocks, bits like ratchet wheel bridges and the ratchet wheel itself, bits like that would not be interchangeable, and they're going to be marked, probably with a centre part marked 1 dot for the time and 2 dots for the strike. With inexpensive mass-produced clocks like this, although it might be unnecessary, it's quite common for repairers to scratch discreetly on the underneath side of the ratchet wheel T for time and on the other one S for strike. So it's T for time on the ratchet wheel and on the bridge, and on the strike side S for strike on the underneath side of both. These are already marked, and that's why I'm not marking them. The gathering pallet here will come off later. Now, wherever possible, remove the nuts on the back plate rather than the front plate. The front plate usually holds these brackets to secure the movement to the case, and they can be somewhat difficult to set up. In this particular instance, they're riveted, but very often they will be screwed, and when you have a choice to strip the clock further, it is better to remove the nuts on the back plate. If you have a suitable spanner, by all means use it, but a blunted and carefully used top cutter is often used as an adjustable spanner. So slacken all 4 nuts. And then remove all 4 nuts. Now the back plate can be carefully lifted off. Whenever you lift something like that, always have a look at the reverse side to make sure that there isn't a washer stuck to the plate somewhere. In this instance, everything seems to be fine. Be careful of these 2 wires. One is a spring to assist the rack hook. The other one is a spring to assist the hammer arbor. Make sure you don't stab yourself with those. Put that to one side for cleaning. And now you can remove the hammer arbor. That's the fly that we spoke of earlier. So that controls the speed of the train by the area of the fly. There's a little clutch arrangement on there so that when the train is locked, the energy built up in that fly can be dissipated by the fly turning on the pinion. Removes the warning wheel, the hammer lifting wheel, the escape wheel. This wheel, to some people that would be termed the 3rd wheel, to others it would be the 4th wheel because it's the 4th wheel in the train. We have the barrel, the intermediate wheel, the centre wheel, and that's actually the 4th wheel in the train. So for some people that would be the 4th wheel. But to other people, the wheel after the centre wheel is always thought of as the 3rd wheel. So the only time there's confusion is if you had to order a new wheel, but then just describe its position. It removes the 4th wheel. These 2 intermediate wheels, this is what makes the clock an 8-day. By putting another wheel between the great wheel and the centre wheel, if it's sort of the right ratios anyway, it has the potential for making the clock an 8-day rather than a 30 hour. So that explains the name intermediate wheel. But they're obviously different, so there's no need to mark them. They're quite different diameters. And that's about as far as we can strip the clock at the moment. The gathering pallet is preventing us from taking the gathering pallet wheel out, and the centre wheel is preventing us from taking the barrels out. Now, to take the gathering pallet off, what you want to do is support under the gathering pallet and the plate with a suitable piece of steel. In this instance we're using the burnisher of a burnishing file. So support underneath there. Then a suitable punch, which would be a punch for driving pins out. Rest that on the end of the gathering pallet pivot, and then get somebody close by to give the punch a tap. Now, these college clocks are dismantled and reassembled many times in a year. Consequently, the hole in the gathering pallet gets stretched and is very slack. So when you drive, for these college clocks, don't drive too hard. But with customers' clocks that are probably only overhauled 2 or 3 times in its life, these gathering pallets are driven on quite tight, and you'll have to give quite a substantial blow to drive the gathering pallet wheel down through the gathering pallet. So in this instance anyway, then only a light tap. That's super. Sure. So now we can remove the gathering pallet wheel and the gathering pallet. Now we have to consider stripping the barrels out. Now we have choices here again. One alternative is to support underneath the plate again with the burnishing file, and then to use the mallet to drive the centre wheel down through the cannon pinion. Now, in actual fact, you don't have to drive it all the way, because it's usual in these clocks for the centre wheel to be tapered rather than parallel. But you will find that you can see in this mallet there are chunks dug out of it. That's because by striking directly on the end here, the end of the arbor can be driven straight into the mallet and split bits off. So what I would do, I would keep an old clock hand close at hand, put that over the square, and then you can drive, and it saves the end of the centre from burying itself in the mallet. Now the alternative is to turn the clock over, and you'll notice that the centre wheel is held in by a little wraparound pin here. So what I would do, rather than subject the clock to the driving out of the centre wheel, which is quite okay, but to me it seems somewhat easier, especially if the centre wheel doesn't need bushing or repairing, to unwrap this pin and remove it, and then take the barrels out. So that's what we'll do. So to unwrap the pin, I would tuck a screwdriver behind the pin and start to straighten the pin. I'm taking some care not to scratch the little spring there. That's the clutch arrangement, so that the centre wheel turns with or the centre arbor will turn with the train, but can turn independently for hand setting. So straighten that pin, then push down on the spring to relieve the pressure on the pin, and then push the pin out. That one is a little bit stubborn, so just straighten the pin a little bit more. You want to be careful not to damage that centre wheel pivot doing this, and remove the pin. Now lift off the spring and put that to one side. Lift off the centre wheel, but check on the underneath side of the pinion that there isn't a little washer there, and also check that there isn't a washer on the end of the arbor there. In this instance, no washer, so we can proceed. Now that the centre wheel is out, we can remove both barrels. And once again, I would mark the barrels discreetly. As we're looking from the back at the clock, this will be the strike barrel. So I would discreetly scratch on the barrel, S for strike, S for strike, mark the barrel arbor, S for strike, and also where you have a cutout, put two discrete little scratches there so that the cover can be put on in the same position. That's just in case the hole is eccentric with the outside down of the barrel, which probably isn't necessary, but we still do it. I wouldn't scratch the barrel on a high grade clock, I would rather mark it with a centre clock mark. But for a cheap mass-produced clock or an inexpensive mass-produced clock, then that's what's usually done. Now, turn the barrel over, hold it in the hand like so, and then strike the top of the arbor with a mallet. To drive off the cover. Surprisingly, rarely does that dish the cover of the barrel. So now remove the cover, put that to one side for cleaning, and now remove the arbor from the spring. If necessary, just open up the inner coil or turn the barrel arbor against the pull of the main spring and then lift the arbor out. The spring should be removed from the barrel to inspect the end. I'm not going to do that now, that will become part of another brief lesson, or another little demonstration. So we'll put the barrel to one side. So in fact we repeat that now with the other barrel. So in this instance, as this is the time barrel, we discreetly mark this T for time, T for time, T for time, and two little discrete scratches there to identify the cutout. This cutout is actually intended to assist barrel cover removal. But in my experience, more damage is caused by removing using the cutout than there is by striking here with a mallet. The reason that we're going to leave this centre in is because we can check the wear there. We can check there is no wear on the hole, there's no wear on the arbor. We can clean the clock and dry it and lubricate it all without removing the cannon pinion. So that's why it's left there. If, of course, the hole or the pivot does need repair, then dry the cannon pinion off in the way that I've shown you. So that's the clock now ready for cleaning. Now that the clock is ready for cleaning, we'll leave the bench for a few minutes and get on and do the cleaning. Now that the clock has been cleaned, we're ready for the reassembly. We have also replaced the mainspring in the barrel, and we put in some heavy oil, sufficient to give the whole mainspring a thin film of oil. But that, the removal and the replacing of the mainspring will be dealt with, as I've already said, as a separate lesson. Oiling will also be dealt with in a handout, so although I might mention some of the lubrication points, I'm unlikely to do justice to the lubrication. This is more an explanation of how to set up the striking mechanism. Anyway, replace the barrel arbor, but when you do that, double check that the inner coil here crosses the hole in the bottom of the mainspring there. So I would, if necessary, bend the mainspring a little bit so that instead of seeing straight through as you do there, make sure that the inner coil is like that. It just lies across the hole. The reason for that is to make sure the end of the mainspring hooks in to the centre of the barrel, or the eye, what's it called? Oh, whatever it is anyway, I can't remember his name now. But the hook in the barrel arbor. So if necessary, use a pair of pliers to bend the end of the mainspring so it does lie across. Then replace the barrel arbor. Make sure the end of the mainspring is hooked. Then replace the cover and make sure that the cutout here registers with the two little scratches that were put there and there. Obviously you mate up the strike barrel with the strike cover and the strike arbor. Now rest the cover into one side of the barrel and then take your barrel over to a bench vise. In this instance I'm going to bring the bench vise to the barrel to save a cutaway shot. And what I'm going to do is put a little bit of paper in the jaws of the vise to protect the barrel, and then just squeeze this side of the barrel in. Sometimes you can actually squeeze it in with the fingers, but most times I find that I have to put that into the jaws of a vise and then tighten the vise to clamp the barrel. Once the cover goes on, you usually hear it click. This one didn't click. In fact, the barrel cover just sank on. So what I would do now is rest underneath the barrel here on the bench, and then just go around lightly tapping the cover all the way around the edge there to make sure the cover is fully on. I can probably simulate that here. Now the barrel cover has gone fully on, and I would lubricate these pivoting points with heavy oil. But now grab hold of the barrel and the arbor and feel the up and down movement of the arbor in the barrel. Make sure that you have end shake and it's the right amount. If the end shake is excessive, it's quite likely that the cover is slightly dished, so take the dish out. In the event that the end shake is non-existent, again, either put a slight dish in the cover or a slight dish in the bottom, depending upon which side you decide needs moving slightly. But you must have end shake in the barrel arbor, and an end shake of about 0.5 millimetre would be about right for a clock of this size. Sometimes it's a little less and quite alright. Other times it's a little excessive, a little bit more than is absolutely necessary. But as long as it's not out of course in other directions, that's okay. Here we're going to assume it as well. Now take your bottom plate and replace the two barrels. So now we need to identify which is which. This one is marked S for strike, so that will go on the right, looking from the back of the clock, on the left from the front of course. And this one is marked T for time, so that goes on that side. Next, I would replace the centre wheel. Before replacing the centre wheel, put a drop of heavy oil on the arbor there, and then replace the centre wheel. Now replace the spring that's going to give tension, and when you put that spring back on, check that the hole going through the arbor here is just visible through the top of the spring. That might be difficult to show on the camera, but we'll have an honest stab at it. It's very difficult to pick up on the camera, but with difficulty you can just about pick out the top of the hole just there. So if you can just see a little bit of hole there, that's fine. Now we're going to pin the spring. Now, if there's a rule here, because on some clocks there is a taper pin holding that spring on, and on other clocks, just 1 minute, sorry. Yeah, the focusing has ceased working. On some clocks there's a taper pin holding that spring on, and on other clocks it's a wraparound pin, as I've just taken off. Now the rule is this. I'll remove this to show you the rule. With some springs in section will have a flat piece here. I'm drawing this nice and thick so that it comes out on the camera okay. And then the spring has a raised piece there, and then we have the rest, the arms of the spring, if you like, the legs then coming out like so. That's a sectional view of the spring, and of course there's a hole going through here. Now when this is pinned, it can be pinned with a taper pin, and the taper pin is going to lie, well, let's draw the arbor as well in that case. There's the arbor coming through with the back pivot, and the rest of the arbor will be down here. Now when this is pinned, there's a taper pin going through here. If that pin should happen to work loose, these raised pieces here stops the pin from dropping out. So in fact it's quite safe. So there's no need for a wraparound pin. But where you have a spring, as we have, like this, with the spring just bent around like so, and the arbor coming up there, you find that now if you put a taper pin in there and it works loose, you would almost certainly have to strip the part to replace it. So because of the danger of that happening, we actually put a wraparound pin in there so that it can't work loose and it can't drop out. And that's the reason why some clocks have taper pins and others have wraparound. So in this particular instance, we are going to have a wraparound pin. So there's our clock, and now these wraparound pins shouldn't, of course, break when you wrap them around, and normally one would file up a piece of suitable metal, but in fact, by chance, these little paper clips happen to be the ideal diameter, and they happen to be the ideal, well, not hardness, but they're nice and soft, and they will take bending quite easily without cracking. So I find to be ideal for this job. So just straighten the paper clip out. Right now I feel like saying, here's what I did earlier. So we'll try it. And now push I'm just going to trap this piece of paper down because it's floating around. That's better. Now push that spring down while you insert what will be the wraparound pin. Right, that's the pin inserted. And before we finally wrap it around, it would be a good idea to check the tension in that. So for that, I'm holding the wheel stationary while I turn the cannon pinion, and I can feel just a nice sort of drag there, the sort of drag one would expect to find with a clutch arrangement for hand setting. So that's fine. So I feel confident now that I can wrap this around. Now, there are two things we need to think about here. One is we want to make sure that the pin, when wrapped around, doesn't lift and rub the back plate. The other thing we might think about is, in the event that it did, we would rather this pin trailed across the plate rather than dig in. So as from the back of the clock this wheel turns anti-clockwise, then I would wrap the pin around in a clockwise direction. So once that's one side of the pin wrapped around, now hold that still while you wrap the other side around. Now cut off the surplus pin. I'm pushing the two ends down as well. Now cut off the surplus pin with a pair of sharp top cutters, or side cutters, it matters not. And now with the brass line pliers, just bring that S in a little bit tighter to the arbor so that it looks craftsman-like, neat and craftsman-like. That's better. Looks quite good. And now double check the height of the pin to make sure that it's not coming up beyond the shoulder. That's fine, that's okay. If it does tend to lift, well then obviously just push the ends of the springs down. So I'm going to check that with an eyeglass to make sure it is right. It is. So we can now go on with the rest of the assembly. I'm going to start with the intermediate wheels, and these are the two very large wheels, and we said that we couldn't mix them up, so we know one is a time and one is a strike. But the only trouble is we aren't sure which one's which. So for the moment we can forget about those. And what I'm trying to do now is show you a logical way of thinking of which wheel is which, because we've got quite an assortment of wheels there to put back. But basically you'll find very often that the striking train has, or the train has extra bits attached to the wheel, if you like, if we put it that way, that will identify them as striking wheels. For example, here we've got the hammer lifting wheel with the hammer lifters, so there's no way that could ever be part of a time train. We've got the gathering pallet wheel that has an extra long pivot here to accommodate the gathering pallet, so there's no way that could be confused with a time train. We've got a pin in this wheel. Well, time train wheels don't have pins in them. This can only be from a striking train, and probably a locking wheel or a warning wheel. This clock doesn't have a locking wheel, therefore it can only be the warning wheel. The fly can in no way be confused with any part of a time train, so obviously that's strike. And what we've got left then is time. That's obviously an escape wheel. So that's how we help to differentiate. Now, this could be the first thing we put back, because that's the hammer arbor. We know that we had a long back pivot that sticks out through the back plate, so that can only go in that position that way up. And that gives us a clue as to where to put the hammer lifting wheel, because we've got a lifter here. There's the right hole for the hammer lifting wheel, so to engage the lifters it can only go in that way up. Now if you like, we can think about these two wheels now, because clearly for the time barrel to drive the center wheel it needs quite a large diameter wheel, and there's the hole for it, so the only right place for that can be there. For the other intermediate wheel, that's got to drive between the barrel and the hammer lifting wheel. Already we know that the hammer lifting wheel must be in the right place. Therefore, to be driven by the barrel and to drive the hammer lifting wheel, the only right place for this intermediate wheel must be there. Now the gathering pallet was at the front of the clock. It has an extra large diameter long pivot, and the only hole that would accept it is that one, so that must be the right place. But it won't go in because the hammer lifting wheel is in the way. So we lift that out again, replace the gathering pallet wheel, and then we can pop this back again. Now if we're going to stay with the strike, the only things we've got left are the fly and the warning wheel. Well, we know the fly was the last wheel in the train. There's only one hole left, and for the wheel to drive the pinion, that's the only place that can go. And now there's only one hole left for the fly, which is there. When you're putting these wheels back, by the way, or before you put them back, it's well worth checking the pivots, because you'll often find that a pivot can be bent, and you don't want to discover a bent pivot after you've assembled and oiled the clock, so check for it now. So just check that the pivots here are straight. Replace the force wheel, which can only go that way up, and the escape wheel, which in this instance can only go that way up. So that's all of the train back without any hassles. Now, have a think to make sure there's nothing else that goes back between the plates. No, there's nothing else that goes back. So now we can replace the back plate. And we have two springs to consider. We've got this one, and we've got the spring which operates against the hammer arbor. Now, the hammer arbor spring will look after itself, you can ignore it. The other spring, which is either for the rack hook or the lifting piece, in actual fact it's for the rack hook. So this spring for the rack hook, in this clock, the right place for it is in that hole there, which is the largest of those 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. It's the largest hole there that fits. So drop the plate on now. Oh, one last point. As far as the hammer arbor is concerned, you want to orientate that so that the bit that gets lifted down here, that is either pointing directly up in this direction towards the top of the clock, or lying between two lifters. Either way will be okay. No preference for either one. Now replace the back plate. So let the spring for the arbor look after itself. Locate the hammer arbor first, and a close second is the spring for the rack hook. Now locate the pillars, and now we can lift the clock up, thumb underneath, fingers on top, and manipulate each pivot into the right hole. Bench looks a mess. It's a mess of business. So thumb underneath, finger on top, and then normally one would start at the back of the clock. Now that all the pivots are into their holes, the next thing you do, the same as that you would do with any clock anyway, is to go around and lift each wheel in turn and make sure that each wheel does lift and drop under its own weight. And then turn the clock over and go through and do exactly the same again. This isn't proofed at all as well, but it's a pretty good indication. Good, everything is free, so we can proceed. The first thing we need to do now is load the spring on the hammer arbor. So bring the hammer arbor between two teeth on the hammer lifting wheel and turn the train so that the stop here rests against the detent. I'm trying to get the light right so that you can just about see it there. So this stop here comes to rest against that stop there, like so. Now the bit that gets lifted here should be lying between two teeth and not being lifted by either one. Then you can load the spring for the hammer arbor. Now, to give you an idea of the right degree of tension there, before you load it, this spring should just rest gently on the back of the hook on the arbor there, so that when you load the spring, it is only lightly loaded. And now check that the spring is functional. And it is. So that's okay. Now, I think next, although one could assemble a clock like this in a different order, the next thing I would be inclined to do would be to put the ratchet wheels on so that we can put a little bit of power on the train, and then we can start thinking about setting up the striking mechanism. So examine your ratchet wheel and look for S for strike. That one's a little bit difficult to see. Let's check the other one. Well, that's got surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, that's S for strike. So as this one is marked S for strike, we'll put that one onto the square and then load the clip. Make sure that the click spring is fully operational and holding the click in the bottom of the teeth of the ratchet wheel. And then replace the ratchet wheel bridge. That's correct, T for time, so the other one must be S for strike. So replace the bridge on the screw.
Well, the only thing is that the dust is getting... It is, yes.
And now make sure, when you tighten this down, that the bridge is centered around the square. And tighten the screw. So. Now we're going to put a little bit of power on the train. That's enough for what we need to do. Now, what I'm going to do is control the fly with the index finger of my right hand, and I'm going to stop the train at the precise moment when the arbor falls off of a lifter, and we'll then try to get that into camera shot for you. Let's see if we can do that before we start. That might be a good view, and I can actually see what I need to see in through there. That isn't necessarily the best view for you. Let's try getting up another view. Actually, I could have. Let's stay with that a minute. Yeah. There we are. That's a good view. So we are looking in here, there, and if I release the fly now, you should be able to see that the lifters contact the arbor. There it is contacting now, so it's lifting. Now the arbor is about to fall off of a lifter, so I'm controlling the fly with that finger to within half a turn of the fly. Let's turn back to our other shot now. I want to stop the train at the precise instance that that lifter, the hammer arbor, falls off the lifter. Right, that is the precise instant where it fell off. Now I want to check the gap between the arbor, or the bit that gets lifted of the arbor, that bit there, and the next lifter there. I want to check that gap. Now the experienced worker will simply look at that gap and say, that's either right or it's not right. But the inexperienced worker will need to measure that gap. And you don't literally measure the gap. What you do is measure it in relation to the number of turns of the warning wheel from wherever it is now until that next lifter there contacts the arbor there. So this would be very difficult to show on camera, virtually impossible. But we can almost get them both in shot, but not quite. You can see at the top of your picture there, you can see the pin in the warning wheel. You can actually observe where it is, just in there. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is allow the warning wheel one rotation. Now that's now had one rotation, and we can see that the hammer arbor still isn't being lifted by the next lifter. So now we can allow a second revolution. So this time, if you like to look at the arbor, and I'll look at the pin. There's a second revolution, and they're still not touching. So let's come back to our pin a minute. There. And what we're going to do is see how much more of a turn on that warning wheel we get before the next lifter actually touches the arbor. It's quite a balancing feat to keep this all in focus for you, but that's about as well as I and the camera can do. So here we go. It's now touching, and if I look at the warning wheel, the warning wheel has now turned by a little over half a turn. So if we come back to the shot that we're used to seeing the warning wheel,